His footsteps slowed, then stopped. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in the air, the subtle tension that crept into the space between us. He pulled back just enough for me to look up into his deep, unwavering eyes. There was something unreadable in them, something that made my pulse quicken. "They're here," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "Now the real fun begins." The word sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, trying to mask the unease curling in my stomach. He turned away without another word, his movements precise, deliberate. He stepped toward the door, his silhouette tall and confident in the dim light. I remained frozen in place, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as if it could anchor me. A deep breath. Then another. But it didn't help. My heart continued its frantic rhythm, an erratic drumbeat against my ribs. There was no reason for this feeling, at least, none that I could name. Yet the sense of something looming, something inevitable, refused to fade. The distant hum of voices drifted in from outside, muted and indistinct. The guests had arrived. I straightened, smoothing my dress with trembling fingers before following him toward the entryway. The house was bathed in a warm, golden glow, the soft flicker of candlelight casting elongated shadows against the walls. The scent of burning wood mixed with the faint aroma of expensive cologne and something else, something sharper, more metallic. I dismissed it as my imagination. He reached the door and paused, his hand resting on the knob. For a moment, he stood still, as if listening to something beyond the threshold. Then, with a slow exhale, he pulled it open. A rush of cold air swept in, carrying with it the crisp scent of night and something unsettlingly familiar. I forced a smile as the first guest stepped inside, his face partially obscured by the low lighting. His eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp, like he already knew something I didn't. He nodded in greeting, but his gaze lingered on me for a beat too long before shifting to my companion. "Right on time," the guest said, his voice smooth yet laced with something unreadable. "Of course," he replied, his tone effortlessly cool. "We wouldn't want to keep you waiting." The exchange was brief, almost meaningless, but there was an undercurrent to it that made my skin prickle. More guests filtered in, their hushed conversations blending together in a low hum. I recognized some faces, but others were unfamiliar, their expressions carefully controlled. A hand brushed against my lower back, light, barely there, but enough to make me stiffen. When I turned, he was watching me, amusement playing at the edges of his lips. "Relax," he murmured, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "You're safe." Safe. The word echoed in my mind, but I wasn't sure I believed it. The evening unfolded in a blur of laughter, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations. I moved through the room like an observer rather than a participant, offering polite smiles and nodding at the right moments. Yet the unease never left. It coiled around me, tight and unrelenting. Then, amidst the noise, I caught something, just for a second. A voice, low and urgent, from the far side of the room. I turned instinctively, my gaze landing on a small group gathered near the fireplace. Their backs were to me, but the tension in their postures was unmistakable. One of them, a man with graying hair and a sharp suit, glanced over his shoulder, his gaze locking onto mine. I froze. There was something in his eyes, something almost expectant. Then, just as quickly, he turned back to the conversation, his expression smoothing into one of practiced indifference. I exhaled shakily and turned away. My head was beginning to ache. Slipping out of the main room, I made my way down the hall, seeking a moment of solitude. The house was quieter here, the sounds of the gathering muffled by thick walls. I leaned against the cool surface of the nearest doorway, closing my eyes for a brief reprieve. A creak. My eyes snapped open. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoed from somewhere behind me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but the hall was empty. The air, however, felt different. Charged. Like someone had been there only seconds ago. "You're being paranoid," I muttered to myself, shaking off the feeling. Still, as I made my way back to the gathering, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. When I returned, he was waiting for me. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. I hesitated. "Yeah. Just needed a moment." He nodded but didn't look convinced. "They'll be starting soon. You should stay close." "Starting?" My pulse quickened again, though I forced myself to nod. Whatever was happening tonight, it was clear that I was more than just an observer. I was part of it. I just didn't know how yet. David's hands rested firmly on my waist, steady and unshakable. There was something intoxicating about the way he touched me, deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. My breath hitched as he pressed closer, the warmth of his body seeping into mine. I was perched on the kitchen counter, my dress slightly bunched up around my thighs, and every nerve in my body was screaming with a mixture of thrill and fear. From the living room, the sound of the television blared, a chaotic mix of laughter and muffled conversation. My father and his friends were only a few feet away, separated by nothing more than a wall. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, not just of fear, but of excitement. The risk made this moment feel even more intense. David's lips hovered near my neck, his breath hot against my skin. "You like this, don't you?" he murmured, his voice low, rough, knowing. I couldn't answer. Words felt impossible. Instead, I clung to his shoulders and gave the smallest nod, my heart pounding. Then, a sound. A sharp clink of glass against the table. A chair creaking. I froze. So did David. His sharp gaze flickered toward the kitchen doorway, his body instantly tense. My pulse pounded in my ears as I held my breath, waiting, listening. The seconds stretched unbearably long. Had someone heard us? Was someone coming? For a moment, nothing happened. Then the conversation in the living room resumed, laughter spilling through the house once more. David smirked, his fingers tightening on my hips. "Relax," he whispered. "No one's paying attention." But I wasn't so sure. Something about the air in the room had changed, a weight settling over my chest that I couldn't shake. I should have pulled away. I should have told David to stop. But instead, I found myself drawn in even deeper, wanting more despite the voice in my head that told me to be careful. Then suddenly, he went still. I opened my eyes, my breath catching in my throat as I followed his gaze to the doorway. Mark stood there. One of my father's oldest friends. His expression was unreadable, no anger, no shock. Just something deep, something I couldn't quite decipher. How long had he been standing there? How much had he seen? A cold shiver ran down my spine, but at the same time, a strange heat curled in my stomach. David reacted instantly, stepping back, his hand slipping away as if I had burned him. His face was carefully neutral, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. "Go," he muttered under his breath. I hesitated only for a second before sliding off the counter, my legs unsteady beneath me. Without looking at Mark, I hurried out of the kitchen and up the stairs, my heart still racing. Underscore 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 underscore. Lying on my bed, I stared at the ceiling, my hands trembling as I replayed the moment in my head over and over again. Mark's silence haunted me. He hadn't said a word. He had just stood there, watching. Would he tell my father? Would he pretend he hadn't seen anything? Or was there something else behind that look in his eyes? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my breathing. But the memory of David's touch still lingered on my skin, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the way Mark had looked at me. Then, my phone buzzed. I sat up, my pulse spiking as I reached for it. A message. From Mark. "You looked good last night. Want to try something even better?" I stared at the screen, my chest tightening, not in fear, but in anticipation. I remembered the way he had watched me, the smirk that had played at the corner of his lips, the way he had walked away without saying a word. And now, he was saying exactly what I wanted to hear. Another message popped up. Come over. I promise it'll be worth your time. Mark had always been the bold one. The loudest of the group, always teasing, always pushing limits. But this time, it felt different, like he already knew my answer. And he was right. David had lit a fire in me. But Mark was about to fan the flames. Mark had always been the bold one. The loudest of the group, always teasing, always pushing limits. He was my father's oldest friend, the man who always had a drink in hand and a cocky smirk on his face. But tonight, something felt different. The way he had looked at me in the kitchen, silent, unwavering, still lingered in my mind. He hadn't scolded me. Hadn't told my father. He had simply watched. And now, he had texted me. You looked good last night. Want to try something even better? My fingers trembled as I stared at the message. Was this real? Was I reading too much into it? But then another text came in. Come over. I promise it'll be worth your time. I didn't hesitate. I told my father I had errands to run, threw on something casual, and grabbed my keys. The night air was crisp as I stepped outside, but the heat coiling in my stomach drowned out the chill. I should have felt guilty. I should have questioned what I was doing. But I didn't. The drive was a blur. My mind raced with possibilities, my heart pounding in my chest. The city lights blurred past me as I imagined what would happen when I got there. By the time I pulled into Mark's driveway, my hands were clammy against the steering wheel. The front door was already slightly open. Like he had been expecting me. I swallowed hard and stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The house was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a golden glow over the living room. Mark sat on the couch, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, watching me with quiet intensity. He didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just stood. And walked toward me. His hands found my waist, pulling me in effortlessly. The air between us was thick, charged, electric. I felt my breath hitch as he leaned in, his voice low and deliberate. No need to rush, he murmured. I want to take my time. I closed my eyes, willing my pulse to steady. But before I could say anything, a sound. A soft rustling outside. I stiffened instantly, my skin prickling. Mark must have felt it too because he froze for a fraction of a second before his grip on me tightened. It's just the wind, he reassured me. But I wasn't so sure. Something felt off. The atmosphere shifted, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. I turned slightly, my gaze flickering toward the window. The curtains swayed gently, as if something, or someone, had brushed past them. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to ignore the creeping sensation on the back of my neck. Mark exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing against my jaw. You're nervous. I forced a smile, trying to shake the unease. I guess I wasn't expecting. A knock. A single, sharp knock at the door. I jumped. Mark's expression darkened instantly. His body tensed, shoulders squared as he turned toward the entrance. Stay here. I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs as he stepped away. The house felt eerily silent now. The television was off. The distant hum of the city outside was muffled, almost non-existent. It was just me, standing there, waiting. Mark reached the door and hesitated. Then, slowly, he unlocked it and pulled it open. I couldn't see who it was. But I could hear the voice. Didn't expect to see you tonight, Mark. It was David. My stomach twisted. Mark let out a low chuckle. Didn't expect to have visitors either. David stepped inside. His eyes found mine immediately. I held my breath. So, he said, his voice unreadable. This is what we're doing now? Mark shut the door behind him. She's a big girl, David. She makes her own choices. David's jaw clenched. I know that. He turned his gaze back to me. But do you? The tension in the room became suffocating. I forced myself to meet David's stare. I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to be. His eyes darkened. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Then, without another word, he turned and walked past me, heading toward the window. I felt Mark shift beside me, his posture going rigid. David reached for the curtain and pulled it aside. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a shadow. A figure standing just beyond the glass, barely visible against the darkness. Watching. A cold wave of fear crashed over me. Mark swore under his breath, moving quickly toward the window. But the moment he did, the figure vanished. Gone. Only the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the night remained. Mark locked the window, his expression grim. Who the hell was that? David didn't answer immediately. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the darkness outside. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply. Someone who's been watching for a while. My breath hitched. What do you mean? David turned to me. I mean, this wasn't the first time. The room felt impossibly small now. I shook my head, my mind racing. You're saying? Someone saw you last night, David interrupted. Someone saw us. Mark crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. And now they're watching her. A chill ran down my spine. My stomach twisted as I thought back to the kitchen, to the way I had felt like someone was there, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard. Who? David's gaze didn't waver. I don't know. But I plan on finding out. The weight of his words settled over me, pressing against my chest. Someone had seen everything. And now, they were watching me.